Hello, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon session today for the Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference. Hopefully y'all got to see the session before and you saw Greg kick off. This is our 5th annual conference. It is our first ever virtual conference. And as a result, it is our largest. So really excited to welcome y'all here today. So I'm Vickie Gibbs. I am the Executive Director for the Entrepreneurship Center at UNC Kenan-Flagler. And we are very excited to partner with Greg and the Kenan Institute on the Frontiers Conference and also the Trends Report. Now, I personally am really excited that we are seeing a tighter integration of the report and the conference this year, and really interested to see how this all works out, and really interested in y'all's feedback as well afterwards. So please let us know that. Now, the session this afternoon is a subject that I personally am very passionate about. It is creating inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystems. And a little bit of my background is I come from the industry side. So I'm a serial entrepreneur and I grew up in high-tech startups. So I have a double undergrad degree, went back and got my MBA and graduated with my MBA in 1998 and started to go to work for high-tech startups right at the dot-com boom. And it was an exciting time to be a part of startups. And we've seen a lot of ups and downs over the years. One of the things that has been consistent is that diversity in entrepreneurship is not very good. And there are a lot of disparities. And for those of you who were in the earlier session, you saw the panelists and the experts there talk a lot about how there are disparities with regard to capital formation. Well, when you think about what it takes for an entrepreneur to be successful, it's more than just capital formation. There are many things that an entrepreneur needs to connect with in order to drive success for their business and personally. And so we're going to address some of those things today related to the ecosystem. Now, the other thing that's going to be a little different about our session today is that we're not going to go really deep into the facts as to that there are disparities. Ashley, in a couple minutes, she is going to set up some of those facts and set the frame for the discussion, but she's also going to touch on some of the solutions. So this session is going to be more solution focused. And part of the reason is because now that a lot of these disparities are very clear because of some of the research that's been done, we are seeing massive experimentation with people really trying to address some of these systemic issues. Now, the other piece of that is that you have a lot of people who are doing these experiments. And what we really need is to share in those learnings and learn from each other. So we've brought together some wonderful panelists who you'll hear from in a bit. And they're going to talk to you about gaps. They're going to talk to you about policies. They're going to talk to you about models and solutions. And our hope is that you leave here inspired and with knowledge, so that you can go back to your own sphere of influence and be prepared to take action. So I really encourage you during the session, lean in, ask questions. We're going to have the Q&A panel open and really look forward to the discussion. So my co-host for this afternoon, Ashley Brown, I'm going to turn it over to her. She is the Director of Research Services for the Kenan Institute, and she and her team have really done the heavy lifting with regard to the Trends Report. So really excited to have Ashley kick off our session today. Take it away, Ashley.
Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. And just want to make sure, can you see my slides? All right, I'm going to take that as a yes. I really enjoyed the last panel discussion touching on disparities in capital formation. I think we're going to build on some of the threads of that conversation here in the Creating Inclusive Entrepreneurial Ecosystem session today. We have a wonderful group of panelists to talk on this subject as well. So as many of you, if not all of you, are here at this conference because you recognize that entrepreneurship is vital to economic growth, and it leads to job growth, more innovation, and a myriad of other societal benefits. And so if we quickly recap and go back to the previous session, we also know that historically, the pathway to entrepreneurship has been more challenging for some due to longstanding and systemic issues. And so Olaf shared a couple of these slides in the previous session, but I'm just going to touch on it really quickly. And so a lot of those challenges were exacerbated by COVID-19. In particular, we saw already under-resourced small business owners, namely minority and women business owners, had to shut their doors at higher rates during the pandemic. And then when you turn an eye towards venture capital and high growth startups, where VC funding had a decent 2020, we did see that women-owned companies were adversely impacted during the pandemic when it came to fundraising. And then similarly, people of color, and particularly Black founders, are still deeply underrepresented in the VC space, both as founders and investors, even as many VC firms have recognized a problem with underrepresentation and under-resourcing Black founders. So with all of that in mind, when we think about trends, we also know that there are trend lines we want to impact and create more growth opportunities that lead to greater access to jobs and wealth for everyone in these ecosystems, whether they're founders, investors, startup talent, and so on. And so the intent of this session and the accompanying trends report, which I highly recommend you go to frontiers.unc.edu, download the report. You can pick out certain sections or download the whole report. But the accompanying session that goes with this presentation really highlights the ecosystem builders who are infusing diversity and inclusion into entrepreneurial ecosystems and providing greater access into the economic engine that is entrepreneurship. And so today we have 4 panelists who are trying to affect change on these trend lines. I'll highlight their initiatives. I'm only going to briefly touch on each one, and then they can speak kind of deeper on each of the initiatives. But each person on this panel is working to build a robust and inclusive ecosystem through various mechanisms, many which lead to models and methods and ideas that can be instituted by other ecosystem builders, many who are on this call. And so these mechanisms include through policy making, through community development, by resource building through investors and corporations, and then also through educational systems. So first, I want to start off with some shared definitions. To borrow from the Kauffman Foundation, an entrepreneurial ecosystem is a network of people supporting entrepreneurs and the culture of trust and collaboration that allows them to interact successfully. The speed at which talent, information, and resources move through the ecosystem can affect entrepreneurs at each stage in their life cycle. And so I imagine many people watching this presentation, see themselves as part of an entrepreneurial ecosystem. As for the word inclusive, we really speak to a broad set of attributes of those in the ecosystem, whether inclusion is based on race, gender, ethnicity, veteran status, rural, urban, LGBTQ, and so on. However, when I talk about specific research or initiatives, if it's specific to any group of founders or ecosystem partners, I'll be sure to specify that. And so quickly, I just want to go over 2 short slides, and there are many more in the report, on why inclusion and diversity matter for firms. Beyond the obvious, research indicates that more diverse teams and leadership can lead to better firm performance, and it can also spur more innovation. So obviously, these are 2 good things we're all aiming for. And so now I will turn our attention to talking about some of these initiatives and giving you kind of a high-level overview of some of the projects that our panelists are working on. And so the first one is related to policymaking. We'll start with the impacts. Through policymaking, we highlight several examples in the report, especially in the wake of COVID-19. But today we have Martha Legg Miller with us, the director of the SEC's Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation. This is an independent office that was established in 2019 based on the bipartisan SEC Small Business Advocate Act of 2016. This office seeks to identify and address the unique challenges faced by small businesses and their investors, in particularly minority-owned and women-owned, rural, and natural disaster area small businesses. So a couple of ways they do this is through analyzing the impact of SEC rules and regulations on small business, and then also making policy recommendations to Congress and the SEC in support of small businesses and their investors. I also want to give a shout out. They have an excellent annual report with lots of really great data and information. We've pulled in some of that data into this report, so I highly recommend you check it out. So in their short time, they've started to make an impact on opening up opportunities for smaller companies to raise more capital through private capital markets. They've made several changes this last year, or advocated for several changes this past year. And so I recommend checking out the report to read over those. One I'm highlight here is, for instance, they recently successfully advocated for an increase in the amount of equity crowdfunding that a company could raise, from about 1 million up to 5 million. And this is important, especially when you see this trend line of growth in crowdfunding in the past year. And so now with that, I want to turn our attention to creating inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystems through community development. This is where we highlight the work of Rodney Sampson, the CEO of Opportunity Hub, general partner at 100 Black Angels and Allies Fund, and senior fellow at Brookings Institute. So in particular, we're highlighting Rodney's creation and implementation of equity districts. Designed in partnership with Dr. Davyeon of the Kansas City Fed, Rodney and Dr. Davyeon saw an opportunity to help solve the country's racial wealth equity gap by developing inclusive local tech ecosystems with a focus to promote Black tech entrepreneurship and increase Black tech employment. The goal is to turn around the statistics you see on the screen, and their approach is holistic, right? They developed an economic development pyramid, which is then realized through these equity districts. So I highly recommend checking out the video we provide on this screen. It's also in the report that you can go view. They also have a paper titled Building Entrepreneurial Ecosystems in Communities of Color. And so what I want to highlight in this pyramid in particular is how foundational earlier exposure, socialization, and skill development are in building inclusive tech ecosystems. This requires more partnerships, but it also allows for people to benefit at all levels. And so it's a great model that Rodney has started in 3 locations to date, and I'm sure he'll discuss this more in our panel discussion. So near the top of the pyramid is market and capital access. And so I want to quickly highlight the venture capital firms, including Rodney's 100 Black Angels and Allies, accelerators, incubators, and other organizations that are connecting Black and Brown founders to funding resources. Again, more details on this in the report. However, and also this is not an exhaustive list. And so finally, I want to discuss resource building through corporations. So amid the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the pandemic fallout, we saw a fair amount of companies come out in support of Black communities and Black business. And so I actually have 2 colleagues at Kenan Flagler, Dr. Olga Hahn and Dr. Stephanie Mann, who are tracking corporate responses and pledges in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests last spring. And I think one of the eventual goals of the research is to see, if companies act upon their words and their pledges. However, we do already know of models of corporations successfully moving from performative statements to develop more meaningful initiatives. And so one such model is the venture studio model. A venture studio serves almost like an incubator, but is infused with capital, consulting services, and access to other resources by corporations to startups. And it really helps supercharge a startup's ability to be successful. And so this model has been growing in popularity in recent years. I borrowed this slide from one of our senior editors, Sekou. So thank you, Sekou, for the slide. But today we have Davion Ross with us, who's a successful entrepreneur who was brought in to run marketing firm RGA's venture studio focused on Black founders called Coalition Venture Studios. And in this model, Black founders can leverage the expertise, networks, and resources of RGA. In turn, RGA has access to talented innovators, entrepreneurs that they can collaborate with and pull into various aspects of their business, including supply chain or product development. So that's where you see these positive, mutually beneficial network effects. And through these intentional and impactful relationships, companies can really move from performative statements to something more meaningful. And so before I end, I also want to quickly mention the UNC Entrepreneurship Center's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Solutions Certificate Program. This is being developed in partnership with Rodney and OHUB, and it's also has partners with Duke and Stanford. So this program helps company leaders at all levels think about how to integrate and operationalize DEI solutions across their business units and functions. And so again, it's about helping companies move, and drive equity-based impact for employees, for suppliers, for customers and investors, and really put their words into action. And so with that, I would say, please go to the website, frontiers.unc.edu. There's a lot more information in the trends report, highlighting all of these different groups who are doing some excellent work. And with that, I will give it back to Vickie.
Great. Thanks so much, Ashley. That was a wonderful intro and setup for our panelists here today. So I see them coming online and getting video ready and all that kind of stuff. So that's super exciting. Yay, and Davyeon made it. Davyeon just came from a board meeting, so I know that he was running late, but awesome. We've got him here now too. So we've got 4 amazing panelists here that I think are going to give us a very broad perspective on what Ashley just set up. So we've got Chuck Easley from Stanford Technology Venture Program, so representing academia. We have Martha Legg Miller from the Office of the SEC Small Capital Formation for the Government and Policy. We have Rodney Sampson, so who's lived the life as a tech investor and now is working on equity districts and a fund. And Davion Ross also lived the life as a technology investor and is now running our Coalition Venture Studio. So instead of me trying to give you all of the details behind it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring them up onto the virtual stage now, and I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves. So this is kind of how we're going to run the session. They're going to go through brief introductions of themselves. I'm going to ask them each an individual question and then some general questions. And I would say I was super excited to see that we already have a question in the Q&A, but this is, an exciting interactive topic. So please put your questions in there and I will pull them into the conversation as we go along. So I'm going to start off, we're going to actually do those intros in a reverse alphabetical order by your first name. So Rodney, you are first up.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Vickie. Is excited to be a part of this conversation and to see co-conspirators in this work as a part of this session. I'll be brief. I've been in the technology ecosystem for over 20 years, first as a startup founder myself. One of the first Black founders to raise millions of venture capital in the country. And as I guess history and the articles that were written might record, the first in the South. And that company was acquired in 2010 for 8 figures. And, seeing the outlier effect of folks like myself and Davyeon and Arlen Hamilton and just different, entrepreneurs that were building high growth companies, you literally could put us all on a jumbo jet and we fit. To date, there have only been about 300, a little over 300 Black and brown tech founders that have raised over $1 million in venture capital. And that's in the last 21 years. So that's the only, data point I'm going to give you today. So to do something about that, my wife and I started Opportunity Hub in 2013. We've been in existence for 8 years. Opportunity Hub exists as a social enterprise. There's a foundation, and then there's the venture fund, 100 Black Angels and Allies as well. I also spend some of my time at the Brookings Institution as a non-resident senior fellow, and excited to be a part of the faculty at UNC, Chapel Hill, and Duke as well. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Rodney. And I'm going to turn it over next to Martha for your intro.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate Ashley's wonderful introduction. She told everybody a little bit about our team. I come from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, and I get to wake up every day and work with a talented team of people who are focused on how we can make sure that access to capital works well for entrepreneurs and their investors, no matter where they're located, what they look like, or what their personal background. And I get to give a lovely governmenty disclaimer that when I talk, I'm speaking with my own perspectives, which should come as no surprise for you, not necessarily on behalf of the entire federal government or agency. But I'm really excited about this conversation today and to be here sharing the stage at the virtual Kenan event. So thank you.
Thank you, Martha. And Davyeon, if you could do your intro next.
It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Vickie. You guys know that I'm coming hot off a board meeting, which ran an hour and a half late. So I appreciate Vickie's flexibility. My name is Davion Ross. I'm one of the founders of ShotTracker. As Rodney mentioned, we have been very fortunate to raise capital. We just announced a round with investments from Hearst Ventures, who is one of the owners of ESPN. Verizon and Evertz. So we've been able to raise approximately 40 million and have been really fortunate. One of my investors was RGA Ventures, and I've had a long-standing relationship with them, being part of the Dodgers Accelerator. Over the last 12 months, we were talking about, hey, what can be done, and how can we make an impact? And I'm very fortunate that RGA approached me about partnering with them to do Coalition Venture Studios based on, the premise that, minorities and Blacks, to be more specifically, got 1% of the capital in 2019. And the last numbers I saw was approximately, I think, 0.67% for 2020. And how can we make a difference? And so I feel very excited and fortunate to be part of, an EIR working with, RGA, in addition to, helping to run and take ShotTracker, which to the next level. But today we'll focus on the Coalition Venture Studios. And our ultimate goal is to be able to provide relationship capital. You guys may or may not know RGA, but they're a 2,000 person, 20 office, large company that is really an innovation company. They've brought some of our, if you're a sneakerhead like me, you're very familiar with the sneakers app from Nike. They brought that to market. They worked on Beats. There's a whole slew of products where they've really been on the cutting edge, and they have relationships with most of the Fortune 1000. So what we're trying to do with Coalition Ventures is to be able to democratize that access for underrepresented founders. Also looking at providing creative capital to underrepresented founders. Creative capital is the same person that's working on the Google project via RGA, gets you help you with your work, and then also financial capital from an investment perspective. So I'm very excited about what Vickie and her team is doing, and I feel very fortunate and privileged to be here. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Davyeon. And rounding us out is Chuck Easley from STVP. So if you could introduce yourself, that'd be awesome.
Hey, thanks, Vickie. Really excited to be here with everyone. I'm Chuck Easley. I'm a faculty member here at Stanford in the School of Engineering and part of our Entrepreneurship Center, the Stanford Technology Ventures Program. I'm also chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for the department, and look forward to talking more about the role of higher education in creating more inclusive ecosystems.
Great, thanks, Chuck. So as y'all can see, amazing panelists, so we'll dive right in. So I'm gonna direct, again, a question to each of our panelists as we get going. So Martha, my first question is gonna come to you. And it's really around, what is the role of government as it relates to, addressing some of these disparities? I know you and your organization have done a lot, but can you also just speak broadly to the role government can play, and also what type of, long-term versus short-term effects y'all are really going for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a hard one to answer because government, it depends on if you're looking at local, if you're looking at state or federal. And I think each layer has a role to play. From my lens at the Securities and Exchange Commission, most people associate us as the regulators of Wall Street, and they think of us when they think about public companies. and they think about investment professionals, but they don't think about the SEC when they're thinking about access to earlier stage capital and entrepreneurs. But facilitating capital formation is one of the three key pieces of our agency's mission. And so it's critically important that we have tools and solutions that work for everybody to bring their ideas to market. One of the challenges that is, as we were prepping for this event and talking as a group, is that there's nothing in our securities law that mentions race, doesn't mention ethnicity, it doesn't mention gender, sexuality, or any other personal status marker. It's seemingly blind as to who you are. But one of the things that we know, if you look at the trends report, and Ashley mentioned that we put out a report to Congress each year. If you look at the report we sent in, and I think everybody who's listening to this today is tuned in because you're interested in the data on what's happening with capital raising. And you know that capital access bears out very differently depending on who you are, where you're from, what you look like, what your network is like. And so we have a question that needs to be asked, and why is that? And is there something about the system that needs to be addressed from the policy side as well as from the market side to make sure that there is not some sort of a legal impediment or barrier that exists that is making it harder to bring ideas to market? So that's the genesis of our team in a nutshell. Our team was created by Congress. It came out almost unanimously out of committee. And I think everybody knows Congress at this point, when they agree unanimously on something, you know, it's pretty important. It's also a rare beacon. And so we were created to really ask, why is capital access challenging in some areas? What needs to be fixed and how should we do it? And there was unanimous agreement that someone needed to focus on that. So that's where our office came from. And, you know, to be clear, the rules that we have on our capital markets, they were created with great intentions around investor protection and making sure that there are the right disclosures for investors and companies, and that we have a well-functioning market. But I think it's incumbent on us to ask about potential unintended consequences in ways that the market is not serving everyone. I think that Yael highlighted that earlier when she was saying you can look at it from the top, but we also have to look at from the bottom and see who's left out of those macro statistics. So happy to have further conversations as we delve into it. I know that the other co-panelists have lots of thoughts about ideas and ways that the government should play a role. So it is incumbent on me to listen rather than just talking about what those solutions can look like.
Thanks, Martha. That was very, very interesting. Excited to dig in later with this. My next question I'm going to direct to Chuck. So sort of thinking on the zoom out is, you know, what is the role that higher ed plays and education plays? And I think there's two sides to that. There's educating the next generation of entrepreneurs, but then there's also the role of research. And, you know, Martha was talking about research and sort of looking at the intention of a policy, but then looking at the real data. So Chuck, can you speak to the role that, you know, higher ed can play in helping to create more inclusive ecosystems?
Certainly. You know, that's a good way to divide up the various roles, because I think there's a lot of different ways that higher ed needs to be involved and has to change, because the future is diverse, and we all know that, you know, diversity is critical for our education and research missions. So the way that we've been thinking about dividing it up is, you know, increases in representation are absolutely critical. And so recruiting, diversifying the faculty, the staff, diversifying the student body, so that those future scholars are there to be the role models for the students, and also to be looking into research and increasing our body of academic knowledge about the role that diversity and race and gender play in entrepreneurship. And, you know, a lot of folks have been doing good work in these areas, but there's still a lot that we don't know about what the effective interventions are. And so that's the first thing that we've been really focused on is diversifying our faculty, diversifying the student body at all levels. And then the second thing that we've been working on is the climate and sense of belonging. And so we've been doing that through having conversations with faculty across the department about diversifying syllabi. If you take a look at the guest speakers that come into the classroom, that come into seminars, the role models that are up there in front of the classroom, the mentors that work with students, and actually gather the data over the past, say, 3 to 5 years is what we did in our department. We were shocked at the results of the cumulative. I think we had 35 out of maybe 500 guest speakers in our department over the past 5 years that were historically underrepresented in STEM fields. So the climate, the sense of belonging, the environment, the representation, and then working on more research in these areas about effective interventions. I think those are some of the really critical areas that we've been prioritizing.
Great, thanks for that, Chuck. Next, I'm going to turn my question to Rodney. So Rodney, you've played a lot of different roles. You've been a founder. You've also with OHUB, y'all are doing things around talent acquisition. You're a funder through 100 Black Angels and Allies, and as an ecosystem builder through your equity district. So the partnership model and all of these entities working together is really something that has been central to your work. What do you think is the role of government, of partners, of education in creating all of the, I guess, details or all of the pieces that you need to create inclusive ecosystems?
Excellent question. It probably took a decade or so, particularly being a founder where you really, you think you can just, build something on a laptop, push it out and change the world and not really need to think about what's happening in government. They're different, philosophical approaches to, kind of the spectrum of capitalism that exists, that a lot of times entrepreneurs and investors who've been able to create sort of this bubble of opportunity and wealth for themselves may not want to participate. And then it just became such a stark reality, particularly when I was working on Kingonomics, 12 innovative currencies for transforming your business and life. And I really double clicked on how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement were literally creating an ecosystem around, national civil liberties and human dignity, and that policy was precedent. And when I started looking at how policy literally had been used to disenfranchise a certain class of Americans or group of Americans, policy was legal, chattel slavery was legalized poverty, Jim Crow was legalized, states' rights. And then it took policy to change that, right? And then I started to double click on the policies, even, looking at the Nixon era and looking at what Donald Rumsfeld did in terms of creating the economic opportunities around Black economic empowerment, which was a part of their policy. And so if you look at even historically what Republicans have done and what Democrats have done, there have been different policies, the creation of the Minority Business Development Agency, through executive order. So policy is just precedent in everything. And so just, in my 2+ decades of hindsight, I've come to realize that we've got to have government at the table around policy formation, putting forth these ideas, understanding how systems work, how agencies work. Everyone wants to kind of bang on the doors of the agencies and say the SEC needs to do this and Commerce needs to do that. And if you don't understand how to navigate and how the systems work, you'll just be like a tinkling sound. And so understanding how policy formation works is incredibly important. And then you got to loop in higher ed, the research, the government contracts, the industry contracts, where we are impressing upon undergraduates and graduate students to look at entrepreneurialism and how it is a part of the American construct. So all of those things are important even before you get to like the industry where the founders are actually being accelerated. And as a founder, to understand how you building a business in America requires the involvement of government, requires the participation of higher ed, the participation of other stakeholders and associations. You'll be a better founder for it, and you'll be a better investor for it, and you'll be a better ecosystem developer for it.
Thanks, Rodney. Great thoughts. Next question, I'm heading over to Davyeon. So Davyeon, you too have held a number of different roles, right? Startup founder, now you're heading up this venture studios, the EIR. Looking sort of back on your path as a founder and someone who's running a, large business right now that has attracted a lot of investment, how do things look the same or different from when you started your journey to now and the startups that are coming through your coalition studio?
Yeah, it's a fair question, and to be honest with you, my experience was somewhat the inspiration for where we wanted to go, because I felt like it was important to, I got tired, as Rodney said, we were the exceptions versus the rule in so many situations when it comes to capital raising, right? And if we're trying to make change as a society, we got to have less of it being the exception and more of it being a rule, so that we can actually democratize access. So, when I took a look at, internally what I was going through, we are where we are today because of the village. It takes a village. It's RGA Ventures making that first introduction to Fox and Intel for us to do a pilot, so that we can get a referenceable client and show people that this technology actually works. It's RGA facilitating an introduction to Nike to have sensors put in their basketball, because Nike has 70% of the Division I market for ShotTracker. It's RGA facilitating an introduction to Verizon that led to a $2 million investment and them now pushing our technology. So when I looked at my path and I looked at the inspiration, all the things that I was fortunate, it wasn't just me, right? It took the entire village to make it happen. So that sparked the thought process on, okay, how do we make this available and democratize this access? Not because they're invested in me, but how do we democratize this access so that we can have more success based on companies like RGA breaking down these barriers to help founders of color? So when I think about it, I think about that experience. And the ultimate goal is to democratize that and make that available to so many different, founders. So what we've been doing is actually building this Rolodex of founders of color. And the beautiful thing about it is that, I'm working with an organization that has decided that this is important. Because to Rodney's point, if the organization at the top levels don't decide that this is important, then we're not going to have the success. So I'm working with an organization that says, hey, this is important, and we're going to commit to this. We're going to commit to every pilot, every project. Let's look to startups to bring them into the fold. The thing about it is that people have been doing this before, but underrepresented founders haven't had a seat at the table to be able to be part of it. I mean, RGA has done this before. I mean, they just did a big project in LA with Shopify, Snap, Jordan Brand, and some company by the name of Dark Store that nobody had heard about before it. But it was a huge success, which put Dark Store on the map. Now, what we're actually seeing in the society is that a lot of people are actually investing. So there's a lot of financial dollars being put. I mean, the last 30 to 45 days, we've seen two black-led VCs raise, over $240 million. That's amazing. But I also don't want us to minimize the power of a referenceable client and non-diluted capital in a project that then you can leverage to raise more capital and then to show other people that you have your technology in place. So, I mean, as I said before, there's three factors: the relationship, the creative, and the financial being the smallest one, because RGA is not a big investor, but where they can really help is having access to that slew of blue chip clients and making that access available to founders and underrepresented founders who traditionally wouldn't have access, which is able to move that needle. And as I said before, that was inspired by the experiences that I had.
That's great. That was really good insights already. All right. Thank y'all for those answering those questions and kind of helping to set the stage for all the different elements that are going on here. So again, for the audience, drop your questions in the Q&A and we will get to those questions. The first question that I want to kind of launch into, y'all, is all of y'all are working on different initiatives. And there's always the question of, well, how do you measure success? You know, how do you know at the end of the day, did it achieve what you wanted to achieve? And for all of the people sitting in the audience, as they're implementing things, they're probably struggling with that same thing. So I was wondering if y'all could give some insights with how you think about measuring success. Is there a way to sort of go about this that is the right way versus the wrong way, that can help inform our audience as they do some of this work?
I'll chime in. You know, that's an excellent question because there's in the conversations around you know, racial equity in tech ecosystems as a way to actually close the racial wealth gap. It started to become a little bit, you know, kind of performative and cliches. I mean, like if a founder is pitching me, they're like, you know, I want to raise capital, I want to execute because I want to close the racial wealth gap. You know, we're committing, you know, $1 million over 10 years, you know, that's $100K a year. And we want to close the racial wealth gap. And I think that as a community, if we don't actually understand the numbers related to actually closing that racial wealth gap, we'll just have great sounding press releases and data points of people saying we want to close the racial wealth gap. And so I think that, you know, from our perspective at OHUB, even inside of, you know, our various programs or our equity district model, and we outline this and codify some of these metrics in the guide we did with the Federal Reserve Bank with Dr. Davyeon, is demonstrating at each level of the ecosystem the different metrics. So at the early exposure level, of course, that's the easiest to socialize and accomplish, because when you're exposing people to the ecosystem, I'm just going to wrap everything in the ecosystem. I won't, you know, go too deep or bifurcate it or triage it out, but it's like raising your hand and say, okay, I'm interested. You know, I've been exposed. Oh, this is interesting. The next level, when you talk about, you know, upskilling and training, well, the metrics are, you know, how many people began the program, how many finished, and how many got placed. And then what did they make in those jobs? And then what's their trajectory for job creation? I mean, for income, let's say for the next 3, 5, 10 years. So that's another metric. You know, at the entrepreneurship levels, how many new ventures were created, but we know business formation by itself does not guarantee successful business. You know, we have to track capital raised, revenue generated, and not just gross revenue, but long-term, we want to track like EBITDA, like what's the net revenue, because that's where the wealth is created when you return that capital to your investors. So when we get at that granular level, you have to have the base unit economics of ecosystem building, and then you have to apply that to your geographical region. So for instance, if you're building an inclusive ecosystem, you want to know in X geography, you know, X% of the population is in this economic income bracket. And then how do we change that? Or this is what the racial wealth gap, this is what the wealth gap in that region. And most of that data is readily accessible in public. And then you start to just chop away at that, you know, kind of like one job created at a time, one company created at a time. And so that's sort of like on the ecosystem side. And then to measure DAIS, you know, that's a whole other conference. You know, you'll get that in the certificate, but there are metrics in terms of how to operationalize DAIS inside of an organization so that it's not just, you know, kind of logos in an annual report, but you can really report out, you know, how many women did you add to your board? How many Black women did you add, or Black people did you add to your board? You know, what's your head count, right? What's your procurement look like? You know, are your products fair and ethical? You know, what's your budget for marketing to Black and brown communities? So all of these different things you can track. And then I think if we lay those out, people will know. So.
Yeah, so that, Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I don't know. I was just going to piggyback on what Rodney was saying, that I think he's bringing up some really good points on kind of the importance of measuring things if we want to see change and document change. One of the things that I think is really challenging on the policy front is we all want data before we take action. And we want to know that we are taking action and we're moving in the right direction based on some sort of information that shows causality. But the really hard piece about the area that we're discussing right now is it's really hard to claim a causal impact with any one specific change or tweak to the system. And that makes it, I think, really difficult. So to me, it comes back to really measuring what matters and figuring out what are our KPIs, what are we actually trying to solve for, and then going from there into the numbers. But that also brings up, I think, a good point that is fleshed out a little bit in the trends report, which is that if we just look at aggregate level information, it's going to completely skew the picture. If you look at aggregate level information about capital raising in 2020, it's going to completely skew the picture. And the reason why is we saw a significant preponderance of deal flow doubling down on existing portfolio companies and not going into new companies. We saw that, yes, venture funds had a banner year and raised a ton of money because people were looking, as Steve Kaplan highlighted earlier, they were looking for those outside returns. What we also saw is one of the largest dips in small and first-time funds, which is Yael. I mean, I'm bringing it all full circle. As Yael was highlighting this earlier this morning, those are the investors that are backing our minority founders, our women founders, our founders that are in non-coastal entrepreneurial ecosystems. And so I think that as we look at the measurements, we have got to get past the headline number that is an aggregate stat, and we have to look at an individual level and figure out what that impact looks like for ordinary people that are building companies all across the country, not just for the spotlight grabbing stat where we have an outlier that throws off the entire data set and really doesn't tell the whole story. You know, if we just look at Davyeon's story and we hear that he raised, $40 million, we think, wow, that is an incredible example of success. Davyeon's in a small circle of really successful founders of color, and that shouldn't be the case. But if we just look at the wrong data point, it's going to throw the entire thing off. We have to look at him in context and figure out how we can make that something that's replicable and scalable, and where he's not sitting as an outlier for national trends and stats. So that's where, when I look at the data, I want to know not just what the aggregate level information is saying, but let's peel back the onion a little bit and figure out what questions we're not asking about the information and what we're measuring, and start to measure other really critical elements that are true performance indicators for where we're trying to go. So that's how I think about the data. Would love to get thoughts from the others on the panel on how they look at it as well. And Chuck, I cut you off right as you were about to jump in, and you might have been saying the same thing. So I'll let you dive in next.
That's all right, Martha. I was just going to chime in with a few anecdotes about, obviously from an academic research standpoint, data is really critical. But even just in terms of like practically doing the work to create change, having access, it's interesting how difficult sometimes it is in academic institutions just to get basic data points about, what's the percentage of historically underrepresented applicants that we have, and how has that changed over time? What's the percentage of diverse staff members, adjuncts, lecturers? All of this is really, really helpful when you're trying to make decisions about what policies within the department or within the university need to change, and the ability to break down, is the problem with our admit rate, or is it actually with the yield rate of getting folks to come once they've been admitted? In our case, the biggest problem has actually been in the number of applicants. And so then that tells us something about where we need to focus our efforts in targeted recruiting. And then the ability to compare across departments. How is our department doing relative to mechanical engineering, or relative to computer science? Why are there differences there? What are they doing that we're not doing? All of this data is really practical, actually, in terms of making productive changes and using our limited resources in the most effective ways to diversify the future STEM workforce in our case. So it's absolutely critical that we have some sharing and also that we have some data on where resources are going. So one of the first topics I got interested in was the role of the endowment, at least in Stanford's case, in investing in more diverse VCs and putting some attention on what percentage of the endowment is actually going to support diverse venture capital funds and private equity funds. What percentage of the people making those decisions come from historically underrepresented groups? I think the question on data is obviously going to get the attention of academics for research, but it's really practical just in terms of these resource allocation decisions as well.
Cool. Davyeon, did you have any comments, or do you want me to jump in with another question?
Jump in with another question. These guys knocked it out of the park. I don't want to go after those three. Not
Cool.
on this question, because they crushed it. I mean, look, I echo their sentiments. So, we could move on. I don't have anything additional to add.
Cool. Well, the next one, I think I want to look at, it actually combines some of the stuff you said, Davyeon, and how RGA has been really instrumental in in the success of your company. And also a question that Mike Nerona had asked in the Q&A, which was the role that investors can actually play in organizations, pushing them to be more diverse or making their own investment decisions around sort of diversity requirements, right? Sort of looking at what they're requiring. Do you think these like policies and ways of operating, do you think they're good? Are they bad? Are they somewhere in between? Because I think a lot of times it's the way that they're implemented. And so I think there's some nuances there that may require some discussion. So I wanted to just throw that out as far as, the role that investors play was sort of either helping or also encouraging very directly companies that they've invested in to diversify and go along the DEIA strategy or diversity, equity, inclusion solutions and really sort of embed this into their organization. So I'll throw that out there.
Yeah, no, I think it's significant the role that investors play in I mean, we all know that organizations take the DNA or the culture coming from either the founder or the board or potentially investors sometime. And I think investors play a significant role. I think that, when you have investors who are trying to bridge this wealth gap and seeing the impact, I think they have to make the first start by looking to really manage their bias. And, the fact of the matter, right? A lot of people have bias and they don't necessarily know it's bias as part of it, just in their decision making, because it's what they've always done. And, I think investors play a really critical role in that, investing in more diverse founders. And I think in situations where they don't invest in a diverse founder, I think it's important for them to be asking the questions. And I've heard some investors talk about this, like, hey, who's on your board? What does your board dynamic look like? What does your team look like? And I think they have power, right? Because the power is where the money is. And if they're investing in that company, there are stipulations and things that they can put in place to help really drive it. I think a lot of times, if you just allow people just ask these, soft questions, but don't put metrics on people, or, like we're talking about, or don't put demands on people to force them to make the change, people are going to go back into their, everyday, organic, natural inclinations. So I do think that investors play a part in not only who they give the capital to, but making sure that they push on their portfolio companies to ask the question of making sure that they have diversity in the organization. And if people, look, if we look at the stats, right, it's evident, right? Diverse teams perform 30% better. Like, as an investor, you should want this. You should want diversity in your organization because there's a higher probability of success. And you should be pushing that down. And my hope is that it keeps trickling down and we see that, that access to capital being delivered to underrepresented founders. And look, the time is now, right? This is probably, if I look at the history of, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, so I've been in the US since 1996 when I came out here on my basketball scholarship. And if I look back in the time period, that I have been in the US, I have never seen the US in a place where people are actually admitting and looking at diversity and trying to empower and trying to make the right decisions. So the time is now. If you're a portfolio company and your investors aren't doing it, we should be asking them about it, and we should all be holding each other accountable so that we could drive this change. Because as I said before, it's going to take a village, and investors play a very significant role. They aren't the silver bullet. Excuse me, they're by no means the silver bullet, but they do play a significant role because money talks, so they have the capital to deploy.
Davion, I think that's spot on. And what you're talking about with having investors who understand the market that they're addressing and that understand the population that needs the product that an entrepreneur is pitching is absolutely critical. Bringing in bias, I think that the topic of discussion that always comes in with bias in the investing space is pattern matching. I mean, we know that you are 21% more likely as an entrepreneur to raise money from someone who looks like you than from someone that doesn't. And that's an important thing for us to keep in mind, because it means that that investor understands the value proposition differently of what someone who looks like them is doing. And so breaking some of the trends that we see where we have founders who, as Arlen Hamilton says, go underestimated, their product is truly underestimated because the investor doesn't understand the customer need that they're serving. That requires us to have investors on the other side of the table who have an understanding of the person they're sitting across from. Because all of this, as much as we break it down into bar graphs and line graphs and trends and data, it comes down to people and how people make decisions. And we have to empower people to make good decisions and to be sophisticated, savvy investors that are at the table, because that is really how we're going to see change, I think. I know that's an area that Rodney's been working on. I feel like I'm teeing it up, Rodney. This is the moment where you should just take it away and run with, okay, I've got the ideas. I've been working with it because I know I've heard about your ideas. So come on, tell us.
Thank you. I mean, that was a layup. I mean,
I'm going to use all the basketball analogies today with Davyeon.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, one of the things that we're excited about in our collaboration with Vickie and her team is this Black Technology Ecosystem Investment Certificate we've created and will be taught during the fall. And we're also excited about the faculty collaboration from Stanford, Chuck and his team, and Duke as well. The numbers might be a little outdated, but in 2016, Pew data and US Census data suggested that 1% to 2% of Black Americans were accredited per SEC standards. So if there are 44 million Black Americans, 1% is 440,000. And then, 2%, you do the math. Now, of course, the data did reveal that was predominantly in personal residences for those who are accredited. We know Dodd-Frank doesn't allow, that was one of the major issues I had with the Dodd-Frank legislation, is when it required your personal property to be included, not to be included as a part of your net worth that qualifies you for these type of investments. But I mean, even if there were 10,000, even if there were 1,000, I'm kind of like, Lot talking to God on his way to Nineveh. Is there one? I'll save it for 3. I'll save it for 10. I'll save the city. And so we believe that we can unlock this class of Black angels and LPs and also limited partners that would be allies in this work as well. And so through education, through exposure, and through giving them access to an asset class through a vehicle where they may not be able to afford to invest in the large venture funds, but they can invest in smaller funds, which will then go invest in those funds. And so I think there's, we talk a lot about racial equity and unlocking the capital that mostly non-Black people control, but we also have to talk about the capital that Black people do control, and how do we leverage that capital to get them into the ecosystem through these type of syndicates or these venture funds. And the Jobs Act is a phenomenal platform, Reg CF and Reg A Plus, and it was exciting to see more companies use Reg CF and now Reg A Plus as a means to raising capital. I mean, we could do a whole nother summit just on that. So, you know.
On to what Rodney's sharing about that. And when he's talking about Reg CF and Reg A Plus, for those who are not steeped in regulatory citations, that's talking about crowdfunding where you raise equity capital over the internet. And then Reg A Plus is really what people often refer to as the mini IPO. But this past summer, we saw, and if you look at the statistics, they're in our annual report. I'll give a lovely plug for it. But we saw that in 2 months over the summer, there was more activity with more small businesses raising equity over the internet using crowdfunding than over the first couple of years of crowdfunding, because of the number of companies that saw this as a lifeline to stay alive and to bring their customer networks, their social networks on board as owners and as a part of the community that was going to keep those companies going. And that's, I think, that was a critical moment, I think, for me to see the power and impact of a relatively decentralized cap table where you have a lot of people who have an ownership stake in a company and want to see it be successful. And you really saw platforms and the companies that were building cap tables using crowdfunding really seeing more success than they had ever seen. So that was a big moment over the summer, and something that I think is a really telling jump in that trend line, which that jump in that trend line really comes down to people and to jobs and communities across the country.
Cool. Thanks. Go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, you know, the crowdfunding developments are definitely encouraging and an interesting trend. Peter Youngkin at Oregon's got some interesting work that also, you know, shows that, you know, these issues of bias and discrimination show up in crowdfunding campaigns as well, unfortunately. So I think that's why, you know, it's really critical, as Rodney and Martha have been mentioning, that, you know, we need to think about not only educating the future entrepreneurs, but also doing education and training for the future investors, and diversifying that set of angels and VCs, and you know, getting communities who have typically been left out of the entrepreneurship ecosystem to you know, become angel investors. And, you know, we know from work by Deepak Hegde at NYU, and also David Shu and co-authors have shown that, you know, co-ethnic investment ties, entrepreneurs are much more likely to get investment from co-ethnic ties. And so I think, you know, rather than waiting for the venture capital community to become more diverse and hire more, getting more folks to transition to angel investment, and then from angel investment to potentially getting into VC, is a super promising area to be working on.
Thanks. Thank you. So I'm going to hit a question from the panel, from the Q&A, and then I'm going to do a lightning round, so just kind of give us a time check. But Sekou Burmese, who's a new professor that has just joined us at Kenan Flagler, he asked a question that speaks to some area of expertise, sports and entertainment, that I know Davyeon and also Rodney have experience with, but also looking at this wealth gap piece. So when you look at, you know, he speaks to the fact that sports and entertainment has produced more Black millionaires than any other industry. Well, when you look at generational wealth within Black communities, that's one of the challenges. And how do you get all of the investment capital that is in the hands of Black millionaires into these constructs? And I don't know, any ideas for how to tie that, or how to educate, or how to unlock that capital and put it towards, you know, startups and founders and investments in these areas?
I mean, I can jump in here because, you know, I think this is a plug for some of the stuff that, you know, some of the stuff that Rodney's doing. I mean, I think that, you know, when I think about the scenario, I think about access. Historically, you know, Black folks haven't necessarily had access to the deals, and when we do get access to the deals, it's too late, right? It's when they go public or later stage, to the point where the value has already been created, and the folks that were in first has already got 100x, and then you're jumping in and you're getting just a small. So, I mean, I think access is the solution. And I think that when I think about like 100 Black angels and allies, you know, the mere fact that, you know, that fund has now access to Mac Venture Capital, who just raised 110 and is an LP in that fund. So if you think about it, it's a matter of, you know, finding the places where we have access so that we can play in the game. There's a lot of, you know, Silicon Valley companies right now that has been built off of like the Black ecosystem, the Black culture, and minority cultures right now. And, you know, we these cultures haven't been able to capitalize on the value that they created for someone else. So the only way to capitalize on that value is to be an owner. And so I think that that type of access is, I mean, I'm sure that there's many other ways, and hopefully what we're doing is this cycle, right, where we invest in, you know, Black founders that then can sell their company, that become Black investors, and they invest in more Black entrepreneurs, and then we have that cycle, and some of these people get access into the funds that are actually creating deals, and those people invest more. So hopefully there's a cycle that we're seeing coming, and I'm really bullish on it because I'm actually seeing it. Like I'm actually doing deals with, you know, as part of 100 Black Angels, and, you know, being an LP there, and doing deals with other friends who historically they would never talk about investing. Everybody's like, oh man, I'm going to put my money in the stock market. So I think more education is important so people understand that this is an investment vehicle that's like a real investment vehicle. More access is important to get access to the deals early enough so you can get the substantial returns. I was talking to a friend of mine who he was telling me he was on the board of a high school in California, and one of the board members in high school was a venture capitalist, and he went to the high school and said, hey, put $15,000 in this investment. That $15,000 was in Snap, and then they go public and they get a check for $24 million. So that's what I'm saying. There has to be a certain level of education and access to the ecosystem and to the deals to really help move the needle. And we hope that founders who can invest have success, and they start investing, and we start building that cycle to really move the needle.
Davyeon is right. You know, when I think about hacking it, just in my experiences of, you know, working to get celebrities and athletes involved in the ecosystem, and, you know, we've had some success, not as much as we wanted to, but now you start to see like some of the work of like Rashawn Williams. So every time a big tech company goes public, you know, everyone talks about Nas, right? But behind Nas, that was really actually making the investments and doing the work, was Rashawn Williams, you know? And so when you talk about, oh, Nas is gonna make, you know, a boatload of money out of Coinbase, and he was in WeWork, and he was in this company, and that was basically all Rashawn Williams. So, but it was developing that trust, right? And I think when I think about hacking it, you know, I see some problematic trends where I see a lot of professional athletes, I see a lot of celebrities, you know, when they basically partner up with managers that are not from their community, their capital does not reach the community. Like they're excited about going into like, you know, Silicon Valley funds. Like they do tours to Sand Hill Road, and it's like, you know, I see folks like Diddy jumping in Silicon Valley funds, and I'm like, Diddy, we need your capital in Atlanta. You know, we need it in Raleigh-Durham. We need it in Kansas City, and, you know, other Black cities. And so, you know, I think about the leverage, you know, just with like the people on this panel. Like if we send a joint letter, you know, from RGA, from Stanford, from the SEC, from UNC, just to the NFL, to the NBA, you know, to the women's NBA, the Major League. But if we send a letter saying we'd like to have a conversation and just talk about the data and where the opportunities are, our collective influence could actually help to move the needle versus like a Black VC or a Black founder who they may not know and have no context, and they're really, really guarded, right? You know, they've got the agent around them, and then the agent is bringing the financial manager to the table, and then you got mom and them and cousin and them. So by the time you have this entourage around them, it's not a lot of stuff that gets through, but they'll always listen to their league. And so we just have to think about how we hack it, because it's definitely a source of capital, could definitely be, you know, as they say, off the sideline and into the game.
Yeah, you know, for a lot of academics, looking at social networks has been, you know, a big subfield. And so, you know, in terms of network effects, there's not much that could do more for a startup than getting, you know, big celebrity endorsement on social media. So, you know, while we might have in popular culture a division here between Northern California and Southern California, in the startup ecosystem, there's a really tight link there. And, you know, it's particularly important for consumer internet and for retail. But there's an important bridge there that, you know, all the digital marketers and all the growth hackers know in consumer internet, how to get access to the, you know, big stars and down in LA. And, you know, it's interesting to hear Rodney talk about the, you know, folks investing in Silicon Valley funds. Meanwhile, Ron Conway, one of the most famous angel investors here in Silicon Valley, is looking to invest in minority and Black funds. You know, I know he's an investor in Slauson and Company. You know, Austin Clements is down in LA and doing great work there with programs to run accelerators for early stage entrepreneurs. So I think there is an insight there about that potential linkage between the startup community and the celebrities, influencers, and so on, which are critical to getting attention and distribution.
Well, the other thing I may add is that, I mean, and that's why I think education is so important, right? Is because, like, people are starting to get excited of Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley is almost, you know, changing, you know, they're already over the tipping point and heading on the other side. Like, people look to other areas. And I think that's what happened, right? People, you know, when you're not necessarily privy to what's going on, you get to the hot thing. Like, if you think about, you know, some of these companies, right, whether it's Clubhouse, whoever, right, there's a point in time where it was heated and now everybody's getting access. So, and I think that's what happens in the capital markets, right? Now everybody's trying to get to Silicon Valley. Well, there are other things that are heating up. And that's why I say part of it is just a ton of education to help people understand we have to be thinking to get on the front end of the trend, and not necessarily when the trend has become, you know, the most popular thing. We got to get on the front end of it.
Martha, did you have a comment? You took yourself off of mute.
I did take myself off of mute because I was sitting there thinking about this from all of the academic folks that are listening and jotting down ideas for research. One of the things that's really hard, and Chuck was highlighting how the impact of social network theory. But one of the things that I think is really hard is measuring different networks and how far they take you as an entrepreneur, and what are the impediments for various different groups. And there is a need for better research about who is bridging the barriers between entrepreneurs, particularly entrepreneurs who don't already have the network to the investors. Who is bridging that network? How is it that the companies are finding success when they are able to go outside of their social network construct? Because that, I think, is critical. And if we're going to really see capital flowing and moving from, as Davyeon was mentioning, from your Silicon Valley, your hotbeds where there is a ton of capital concentrated, but it needs to start chasing the deals that are elsewhere in the country. What's the mechanism for connecting to those founders? In particular, what's the mechanism for connecting outside of those investors' own personal networks so that the funding actually really flows well? And that's an area, if you've got ideas on research for it, or you want to have further conversations, email me. I would love to have a conversation. That goes for anybody who is listening, because it's an area that we really need to start measuring and figuring out how capital is going to start flowing around the country better.
All right, so I would love to carry on this conversation for the rest of the afternoon, but Sydney, in organizing the conference, would really be angry with me, and she's done an amazing job organizing and getting this set, so I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to do a quick lightning round, and then I'm going to bring us to a close. So the lightning question is, in 20 years, what would the world look like? How would you be able to tell if we were successful in building inclusive ecosystems, if we were successful in working together on some of the things y'all have been bringing up? What would look different, and how would you know that we'd done the right things now? What would it look like in 20 years? Y'all can go in whatever order you want.
I'll jump in first. I think the field of academia and STEM in particular, which is where I'm embedded, would look more like the rest of the country and would look more like the rest of the world. And the community in entrepreneurship and venture capital would also look more like the rest of the world, and we would have closed the huge racial and gender wealth gaps.
Yeah, I'll go next. I think for me, it's a matter of, I'll determine success or ultimate success when, when we look at the funding metrics and they're directly proportional to what the gender breakdown, the racial breakdown, and because there's a pretty significant disparity now in regards to like the investment dollars versus, what we look like as a society. So I think that, if we can actually get those numbers, closer or directly proportional to our basic, society dynamics, I think that would be significant success. And I say that with a lot of hope, for, our kids to not, have to deal with some of the things that we've dealt with. I mean, don't get me wrong, we've made progress, but it's been small and we have a long way to go. So my hope is that it will be directly proportional to the traditional or organic gender breakdown of our society, gender and racial breakdown.
I'll retweet what Davyeon said, and I'll go before we have a Rodney mic drop moment, because that's how I feel like we're going to end. It's just the way that it feels. It's just the vibe I'm getting right now. But similar to what Davyeon said, I hope that one day demographic data on who is raising capital and who is investing in entrepreneurial ventures is boring. That's my hope. I hope it's really boring because it looks just like the population of the country. So instead, we're having panels that are talking about the problems that the entrepreneurs are actually solving, not the problem that they're having getting the capital to solve the problem. That's what I hope we're talking about in 20 years.
Martha, I after that, you made me feel like I'm like the closing revivalist.
You are, Rodney. Come on, you are.
I gotta bring it.
Hey, Rodney, before you go, you got to do one of these right here.
Oh, you're like that?
For emphasis, right here, and then you can give your statement.
The closing revivalist is also the one that raises the largest offering. To fund the church's annual operations. So, I'm working on this new piece that's actually coming out tomorrow with HRNA advisors. And we were able to aggregate the data that shows that based upon Black and Latinx representation in the US population, right? Just as looking at the US population and what representation looks like, just to get to equality of representation, not equity, but equality of representation, we've got to basically skill and upskill and hire 1.1 million Black and Latinx people. Like that is a goal, and it's being framed as this like $50 billion racial income gap, right? So that's just income. So to quantify this, in the next 10, 20, 30 years, I'd like to see 1.1 million Black and brown people in the tech ecosystem. Now that's just income and representation. Where I think the wealth happens is when, let's take the 2019 VC numbers, and you look at approximately 11,000 firms that receive capital. When we can point to a year where there are 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 Black and brown firms, and it's like so normalized that nobody can release an article about a Black founder raising capital because why? It doesn't matter, right? And I think when we start to think about both sides of that coin, jobs, skills and jobs, and then startups and capital with access to markets, that's when we actually see the wealth decrease, right? We won't end the wealth gap. This is the sad part of the sermon is we won't end the wealth gap in 20 years, right? It's actually growing. Innovation density is exacerbating it. Add a pandemic, add all the other stuff, it's exacerbating it. So like, if we could in 10 to 20 years, like just stop exacerbating it, you know, if we could stop the slide into this abyss where they're projecting by 2053, 0, and now with the pandemic, it's 2043, I think, right? So we've got work to do just to slow it down. And if we can get 1.1 million Black and brown folks into the tech ecosystem, the positive thing about the tech ecosystem and the fourth industrial revolution is that it is not a finite industry. So anyone that, when I say let's get 1 million Black people in the tech ecosystem, it does not mean that we push white people out. It does not mean that we push non-Black people out, right? The ecosystem is ever expanding, that everyone can fit in it. And like this truly rising tide lifts all the boats. The ocean is there. We just got to get more folks with boats and get folks out in the ocean. And so that's what I'm encouraged about. I think conversations like this, where we go beyond the performative and kind of like, you know, the acknowledgement of the problem. We did an amazing year last year of acknowledging the problem. We quantified it at Brookings Institution that to upskill 1 million people is about $15 billion, and to fund 10,000 Black startups, Black and brown startups, was 11 billion. $26 billion is the number, and it would be distributed across US cities. Now, a year ago, if I said, you know, if I came on this panel or any conference live in person and said that it's going to cost $26 billion, y'all would have laughed me out of the room. But in the face of multiple trillion-dollar stimulus packages, and now an infrastructure bill that's worth trillions as well, 26 billion just sounds like, you know, a seed round, right? So I think that because our perceptions have changed, and we're thinking bigger about what it's going to cost to actually do this work, that we're starting to, you know, slowly but surely inch toward it. So the doors of the conference are open.
Hey, just finish right here.
Like this? All right.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. There you go. Now you're done. Now you're done.
Nah, but it's so fun working with all of y'all. You know what I mean? I really want to say that publicly and let it be recorded on the record. From government to higher ed to industry to the ecosystem, these are exciting times.
They are. Well, and I want to thank you, all of our panelists, so much. Thank you for the audience hanging in there while we went a little long, but this is just the thing that I'm excited about, is that we've got people at the table and we're starting to see some of that action. We're starting to feel like it's not just a dream, but that there is a pathway, but it does take everyone getting engaged. So speaking of engagement, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Easley setting us up. I do want to say that if you want to continue the conversation, we are actually going to be doing some networking sessions. So there's going to be 2 rooms available. Sydney is going to drop the links into the chat as I talk about them. The first one is for the first session today, which was around discussing the content there, which was about financing, disparities in financing, and all of those areas. The second one is the one that we were just talking about. So if you're interested in having more discussions about creating inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystems, join us in the second link that you're going to see. And these are going to be Zoom, so we can have more of a conversation and truly get into the networking. So finally, you know, please join us back here tomorrow at 11 a.m. We're going to be talking about healthcare and innovation, and some more on teams and talent and remote work, and how those 2 things that have really driven things over the past year, how they are impacting things as we move forward. So thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing y'all in one of the 2 networking rooms. Bye.